Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century from the periphery. This podcast is ad-free and accessible to everyone thanks to the generous donations of Patreon supporters on patreon.com/firethesetimes. For as little as $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help keep this podcast independent that way. The Fire These Times is named after the James Baldwin book The Fire Next Time, and the music is by Ibrahim Youssef. Thank you for listening and take care. This is a conversation with Musa Okwonga and with Justin Salhani. We are going to talk about the relationship between football and politics. And I think in recent weeks, with the whole, Roman Abramovich owning Chelsea and his links to the Putin regime, and obviously with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen these conversations becoming more and more mainstream. And so even if you're not particularly like a big football fan, or maybe you don't even care that much, that's totally fine. Of the three of us here, I'm the one who knows least about football, but this is really a conversation about the politics of sport, in this case obviously football specifically, and sports washing. So even if personally you may not have this interest or whatnot, I think as activists, as intellectuals, as writers, as academics, as journalists, as just regular folks, what have you, I think we have a very specific responsibility to do something about sports washing, which you will hear in this conversation. We got a lot into like the Qatari context because Qatar is obviously hosting the World Cup at the end of this year, and there's a lot of opportunity for activists and others to do something about Qatar's horrific human rights record. And I don't say this lightly. I actually think that there are very concrete things that we can do, which we discuss in this episode. And if after listening to this episode you want to take part in something, anything really, feel free to reach out to me. You can do so either on Patreon, that's the fastest way, or send me a DM on the podcast Twitter account or the Instagram account, or just send me an email, which you can find on the website of the Fire These Times. So, as always, folks, thank you for listening and take care.
My name is Musa Okwonga. I am the co-host of the Stadio football podcast, and I'm also a writer. I write essays and books about football, politics, with an emphasis, I suppose, on race. And I focus on Europe, primarily the UK and Germany.
So I'm Justin Salhani. I'm a journalist. I'm currently working for an outlet called Oh My Goal, where I've covered things like sports washing, among other things. And I'm also a writer and journalist who was previously based in Lebanon, the US, and Italy recently. Now I'm in Paris, France.
We'll be primarily talking about the relationship between football and politics. And I guess a good way of starting, as good as any, is for me to ask you, how did you get into football? Like, give us some kind of nice backstory or what have you. And the follow-up to that, and I can re-ask it later, it's fine. Like, when did you also start thinking specifically of that this is also a political sport, as in like there is a political dimension to the sport?
Okay, how I got into football. So my grandfather was actually he was the president of the Ugandan Football Association in the early 1970s. So we have football as a pedigree in our family. Two of my uncles actually played for the Ugandan national team, which was a really good team, actually. By the time my grandfather had stepped down, they were in pretty good shape. And so in the late 1970s, they went to the final of the African Cup of Nations. So football's always been a thing in our family. And in relation to the overlap between football and politics, that again has always been part of my family because members of my family were part, I suppose, of what we would call a resistance. So football was a place where you saw protests against dictatorships. You saw football players from the national team taking part in subversive dances, protests. So it's always been in my consciousness. I suppose as a writer, I've never divided the two. I've never been able to separate what happens on the field from what happens off it.
Yeah, from my side, I grew up playing. Like any kid who grew up in the US with, a foreign father, more or less, even though my dad wasn't really and still isn't really big into football. You watch the World Cup. And so I remember the first time walking in and seeing the World Cup on TV when I was 7 years old. and kind of ran with it from there. I was a big player. I played in college, had a brief stint kind of trying to manage a professional career while also playing professional football, or trying to play professional football in Lebanon. And then since then, have kind of mixed it with writing and other things like that. I guess when I noticed it was political for the first time, I've never really separated the two. It's very clear that, there's a lot of things related to nationalism, to nationality, to kind of patriotism, for all that's good and bad in football. But definitely when I was in Lebanon and covering, because I was kind of simultaneously covering the national team when they had this run trying to qualify for the World Cup, and you would be in stadiums and it would be impossible to separate the politics from the football, because you'd literally have political chants before the game. And I remember one game in particular when Lebanon was playing South Korea in 2011, I believe, or early 2012, in the qualifying stages for the 2014 World Cup. And before the game, there were chants for both Saad al-Hariri and Hassan Nasrallah. And then at the end of the game, because Lebanon had won, there was just chants for the national team and kind of these like patriotic nationalistic chants. So, if I hadn't been aware of it before, it became very obvious from that point on.
For me, it's so of the three of us, I'm the one who knows the least about football. That's obvious, and I would mostly follow the World Cup from a very, very early age. In Lebanon, as Justin, it's a huge thing. It's just, you would see a ridiculous amount of like flags. Brazil, Germany, Italy, Spain, Argentina, what have you, the England flag. You would see a lot of them, sometimes waved by folks who have themselves dual nationality, but often actually just not. And it was just this thing where at some point it became very obvious that a lot of politicians, a lot of political parties were actually using the World Cup for specific purposes as well. One big thing in Lebanon, for example, which is related to access to electricity or access to cable, access to that sort of thing, would be like, will we be able to watch the World Cup this year? There was this thing, I remember. And I remember one of them, we had to pay cable to watch it. I don't remember. And then the one after, the government intervened or what have you. So it was something along those lines. I don't remember the details. I'm sure someone has written something about it. But it was always like, it wasn't just a neutral thing, essentially. I wasn't really, at the time, thinking of it in the sense of like sports washing and all of those things that we'll get into, obviously, now in this conversation. But there was always a sense like this thing is just so big. And especially when we talk about the World Cup, but not just the World Cup, obviously. But it's just so big, and there's just so many people who care about football in one way or another, that it would just be impossible. There's a lot of money to be made from all of this, and usually when there's a lot of money to be made from all of this, something is, there is some kind of political dimension to this, right? And so that's how it kind of started for me. And other than that, I will proudly say that I represented one of the youth teams of Lebanon when I was a teenager, and we had our asses kicked in Dubai for like 11-1 or something like that.
Yeah, but you still played. That's incredible.
I did play, yeah, I played.
It doesn't matter you get thrashed, you played, man.
No, that was fun. Okay, so we started, we've been chatting for a while, the three of us, but we been chatting specifically on this topic and like surrounding topics when, like, shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, the second wave of it, I should say, after, end of February. Very soon after, we started seeing stuff like, the Abramovich-Chelsea connection, number of different debates around it started popping up about the difference between, English, like the English football and versus German football, different models, different what have you. We'll try and get into some of it, maybe not necessarily in detail. Well, my two guests already have their respective channels that you can check out, and I will put in the description. So we won't get into that kind of details. But I guess, what have you seen in the past, let's say, couple of months, slightly less so now, that you think has changed football maybe for good, or has the potential of changing football for good? Let me ask it this way.
Wow, that's an amazing question. I think the sanctioning of Roman Abramovich for his connections to Vladimir Putin and Putin's regime, I think that was the game changer, because that was the first time that even people who said that football has no place in politics and vice versa could not ignore a hard reality. I think those people who were always dishonest, I don't think they meant that football had nothing to do with politics. I think they were trying to make us ignore its role. But that was the moment when I think the supertanker finally crashed into the coral reef, if that makes sense. That was the one. And I think it happened at the worst possible time for people who tried to combine politics and football to negative ends, because with the Qatar World Cup coming up in December, I saw a different type of discourse. I saw people actively going, even if we watch this won't change our perspective on the place, the entity, the people hosting it. That was the game changer for me.
I would very much agree with Musa's point about the sanctions on Abramovich. I would also say that, kind of adding to your point, Musa, about you started to see the questioning of certain people within the world of football change. So, for example,
Yes.
Eddie Howe, the manager of Newcastle, who's a team that's just been bought, by the Saudi takeover, is starting to be pressed by journalists about his views on managing a team that comes from that kind of money.
Right.
I want to say that maybe one other thing that happened in the last year, which, if you listen to Stadio, for example, Musa and his co-host Ryan have talked about quite a bit too, about the power of fans. And we saw that the effect that fans can have last year when there was this attempted creation of something called the Super League, where a number of top clubs, top European clubs, tried to break away and form kind of a, what would be a commercial behemoth that would focus fully on these sort of teams and have more of like a global audience, kind of serve that global audience to the detriment of maybe, I would say local fans, but there are international fans as well who very actively and forcefully came out against that too. But seeing the effect, the power that fans can have, and then seeing also from the other side that maybe football media in particular is hopefully waking up a bit and starting to push this issue a bit more. We've seen some public, let's say like journalists on Twitter and or other places kind of have public reckonings or express kind of doubt that they wish they had pushed these questions harder maybe a decade ago when, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar sort of came into world football. So I think all these things coming together are creating something where it's still a long way to go, but maybe we're seeing the seeds of something starting, and it does give a bit of hope, I think.
There is a sort of okay, I'll just put it this way, maybe a pessimistic side of things and an optimistic side of things at the same time. The pessimistic side of things is basically it really took Putin crossing a line that many thought he wouldn't. And the horrors being at such a scale and such a speed even, that it just became too impossible it just became too difficult anyway to deny or to ignore at the very least Abramovich, because he has a very direct link to Putin. The fact that he's part of those so-called negotiations, for example, that there is a very clear role that he plays in that entire world. And the more optimistic saying like, fans have managed with the Super League to challenge what would otherwise be, or what would seem at the very least to be something very difficult to challenge, maybe even impossible, I don't know, but very difficult to challenge at the very least. And they did so anyway. So the lesson here is that it is possible politically, just realistically, it is possible to make demands. It is possible to, pressure your club or to demand that your club, the one that you support or the team or what have you, that it does better. We know this from the lessons of like student movements within academia or within other the arts or what have you, like to divest from fossil fuel, for example. We know that this has been a campaign for about a decade or so now, which with some considerable success, I should say. Still a lot to do, obviously to do. We're nowhere near divesting as much as we should be, but it's there, it's getting there, and the momentum is picking up. And we know that there is this thing that happens once a momentum picks up, whether for good or for bad. Like now with the invasion of Ukraine, this is a bad momentum in that sense, or at least it started in a bad way, and then you can capitalize on it in that sense. We can see that change is possible. Now, there are still a decent percentage, I would say, of folks, fans, players, maybe coaches, other stakeholders or what have you, that still don't want to talk about certain things. There's still, we're seeing with Qatar, there is still sort of a tendency, maybe weaker than it was before Russia invaded Ukraine. I'm not sure. We'll see when the actual World Cup happens, obviously. or in the run up to the World Cup. What would you not? Yeah, let's put it this way. I'll ask it in two ways. Like, what would you say to these people, assuming they were listening, and otherwise, if they don't listen, what can we sort of do about it? Those of us who want to act upon these realities that we know. And I'll talk more about Qatar in a bit, but I wanted to have your thoughts first.
I mean, honestly, in every video that I release that has a tinge of politics involved, these people are in the comments. So I am speaking to these people quite often, I think.
Yeah.
Honestly, I want to step back for a second and say, why not? We can address them directly and say that football and politics have always been connected. Any attempt to kind of separate those two things from a fan perspective, I feel, is more about kind of making ourselves feel comfortable that football is entertainment. But I also think this is kind of a message that's coming from up high. So if you're a fan that has really believed that football and politics should be separate, and now you're kind of coming around to the fact that, well, wait a second, maybe it's not. I think, we're happy that you've come to this. I would say, like, I'm happy you've come to this sort of conclusion, and now maybe we should look at why this is the case. Why have we been sold that football and politics are so separate? Because they quite clearly are not. And this is coming down from up top, from as high up as FIFA, with Gianni Infantino, who's now the head of FIFA, and who lives in Qatar. FIFA is based in Switzerland, so I don't really know why he's living in Qatar in the run-up to the World Cup. I mean, unless he really wants to be on the ground to see how things are forming up. But if there's actually a really great Vox video in particular on Gazprom, and how Gazprom, which is obviously a Russia state-owned company, is sponsoring teams in Germany and in Russia on either side of what would technically be the Nord Stream gas pipeline. So I mean, there's ample evidence that football and politics are connected. I mean, this is clear. Many football fans, ultras, take political stands. There are football clubs that have been built out of political movements. But if you are just waking up to this, and if you're angry about it, I think you have every right to be angry about it. And there's a lot of meaningful ways that you can place that anger and turn it into something positive, I think, which you're seeing a lot of fan groups do, for example. And one of the best examples of that, I would say, is Bayern Munich, because Bayern Munich's fans have been speaking out very heavily against their club's involvement in Qatar, because every year, for years, their club has gone to Qatar and done like a training camp there. And there's a very vocal segment of the fans that have been very openly opposed to this happening, speaking out against it because of the human rights violations. So yeah, I think I've rambled on long enough, and that's a good place to stop.
That Justin, I was listening because it's all excellent, and I would only have jumped in, either of you, Joey, if I felt there was anything that I could add to, but that's outstanding. And Joey, very quickly on the optimism and pessimism framing, I completely agree. I think that I would even actually say I would compare your pessimism point to, and just dovetail on something Justin said. So you talked about the pessimism that it took this much to get to this point. And Justin talked about people waking up to the fact that politics and football perhaps can't be separated. I almost think that everyone always knew that, because what was interesting with this was the response of the Chelsea fan base, many of whom actually wrote to us. Ryan and I, we did a Stadio podcast on Chelsea and Roman Abramovich's ownership, and so many people wrote to us going, yeah, we turned our faces away. We knew it was happening. And I suppose it's a bit like, when there's I'm going to draw a terrible analogy here, but I think there's a point to it. When someone is killed in the neighborhood and there's like, oh my goodness, the killer, there's the first two waves of outcome. The first outcome is, oh, he was such a nice family man, he was a decent human. And then a few days afterwards, it's like, actually had a terrible temper and all this stuff was going on. And it's almost like the second wave is the consciousness of all the people that kind of knew something terrible was happening and was brewing, but didn't really have the confidence or frankly the integrity to confront it. And I think what's changed in football is not that people are suddenly aware of it, it's them thinking, we actually have to take a position on this because it's become impossible to ignore. In terms of what we'd say to people who are listening, I echo Justin's point again. I think there are people, I'm not saying specifically to this podcast or to Stadio, but if we look at the sophistication of sports washing, the sophistication of people that buy, particularly petrostates, that buy football clubs in order to change reputations, those people are listening a hell of a lot. Their producers are listening, their researchers, because their responses are so sophisticated to sports washing. I mean, the way Qatar have welcomed inquiry, we welcome conversation. The way that the UAE have run Manchester City, in expert fashion. We can assume there is always someone listening at some level, whether they're a junior researcher or a senior person. So my messages is not for them because they've heard plenty enough already. I suppose what I would say is to European football, why have you allowed El-Khalifi, the head of PSG, to be in charge of the most powerful association of football clubs in Europe? Why have you allowed that to happen, even when he allegedly threatened a match official during the exit of PSG from the Champions League? You got rid of the European Super League, but by having him in charge of that organization, you are basically just laying the foundation for another hybrid. So at what point, and this is the thing, the only reason I say like people haven't woken up to this all of a sudden is, well, I don't want people to hide behind fake innocence. I'm assuming everyone's completely aware of what's going on here, including Infantino. And suppose my message really is, at what point is the juice no longer worth the squeeze? Because we've seen Vladimir Putin, people took that man's money, they took that regime's money. And in 2018, the World Cup was being hosted in Russia. Putin was known to be bombing hospitals during the tournament.
Yeah.
So at what point are the war crimes being perpetrated by these states hiding behind football for legitimacy? At what point are the war crimes no longer worth it?
I would, so a couple of things. One thing that I wanted to say and I forgot, but the dichotomy between political and apolitical for me is kind of a false one, because choosing to be apolitical about something that's so manifestly political is a political decision. It is a decision to just not pay attention, or to not want to talk about it, not want to think about it, not want to engage with it that way. But not doing so doesn't, like, if you're a Chelsea fan and you don't want to think about Abramovich, that doesn't change the fact that he's there and that's what he's been doing, and he's been the owner for I don't know how long now, you know. It doesn't change the fact that he's a Russian oligarch, you know. It doesn't change the fact that he made his money through his links with Vladimir Putin. Those facts aren't changed. What changes is what you do about it, or even like assuming like an individual maybe cannot change everything, even how you think about it, how you approach the topic, how you do your own research, how maybe you engage on it online or what have you, you know. This is what happens. And the difference is that maybe at the individual level, most of the time it doesn't make a change, but there is this thing that happens incrementally. Let me put it this way, and this is a very visual thing almost. Like, it will be very difficult right now to picture a match between, I don't know, two football clubs and having Vladimir Putin himself attending. And I'm talking not in Russia. I'm talking like, you know, in London or what have you. It's just not feasible anymore. It's too obvious. It's too visible. It's too out there because, as I said, he crossed a line that many thought he wouldn't cross. But it is still possible. I mean, I don't know. But before, as of 2 months ago, it would have been still possible for either Mohammed bin Salman himself or someone appointed by him. It would have been possible for the Emir Qatar or the one of Mohammed bin Zayed of the Emirates, the United Arab Emirates, to have to again either them personally or one of their representatives to go there in the name of Qatar, in the name of Saudi Arabia, in the name of the UAE and what have you, and essentially sports wash. And sort of this brings me to the second question, which is, or to the question. We've mentioned sports washing. Most people will have some idea of it, I think, probably, my best guess. But how can you explain how sophisticated sports washing can be?
Oh, great question, Justin.
Yeah.
Give you the hard one.
I'm happy to jump in here because it really is a lot. It works on multiple levels and on multiple fronts. So on one level, for example, a good friend of mine who Musa, maybe you know as well, Fabian Goa.
Yes, great Fabian.
He's somebody to really look to on this topic as well. I think he's taught me a lot. One of it is association. So if I say to, the two of you here, if I say the Emirates, maybe you will think about the United Arab Emirates. Mm-hmm. Now, if I go to a football fan and I say the Emirates, they'll think about Arsenal. They'll think about North London. They'll think about Arsene Wenger, Thierry Henry, maybe, a number of actions that have happened there, great games, maybe if they visited the stadium. And that takes your mind away from sort of the negative perception of what's going on with United Arab Emirates. So that's the first side. The second side, I
And
think, gets a
even
lot.
before you get into the second side, Justin, I remember the conversation we were having just yesterday about Le Pen and the name of Le Pen, and now Denise wanting to not use the name, even though she's still part of that saga, what have you, and how that even that in and of itself is already having just the name change in and of itself is already having certain political.
It's
Can I say
branding.
before we continue,
Yeah.
Justin, that's such a brilliant example that you've named. I'm so glad you started with that. But yeah, please carry on.
That's Fabian's example, so I'm not going to take credit for it. But so that's tier one, let's say. Where it gets a lot more nefarious is that, it can go, obviously it goes a bit deeper here, right? So then it obviously goes to the other side, which we all see, which is kind of how, like, for example, recently with Chelsea fans backing Roman or chanting his name. So he gets like a public support, So that's the second side. Now, where it gets really deep, I'm going to pull out an example that another human rights worker that I spoke with had told me about. It was basically with the recent Newcastle takeover, once again from Saudi Arabia. So there was a prior attempt to take over that failed. And essentially what had happened was you had a very large, popular, famous English football club. They're essentially underperforming in the league, and they've got what was at the time, I think, ranked the least popular owner out of any in the Premier League. So out of the 20 clubs, he came in either last or second to last. Now, then what starts to happen is that Saudi starts to spread word that they're interested in the club. The fans look at this very positively because they've seen what's happened with PSG. They've seen what's happened with Man City. They know that, like, we're going to have a lot of money. Big names will come. It'll take us up. We'll start winning trophies. We'll get to where we deserve to be. Now, essentially what happens, for one reason or another, the takeover does not come through. So the fans start to mobilize and start to put pressure on their MPs. The MPs then, which we had, I think, if I'm not mistaken here, there was a handful of MPs that called the Premier League to put pressure on them to say, listen, the next time this comes around, we need you to push that through, even though a number of those MPs had been critical of Saudi Arabia's human rights violations. So essentially what you see happening here, the greater phenomenon, is that through media releases, public, spreading word and getting this out in the media, Saudi Arabia has used, as an autocracy, has used public pressure to put pressure on a democracy to then, by their own accord, go through and push through the takeover of a club that they can use as a sports watching mechanism. Right. And then beyond that, I'm sorry, Musa, just last point. Beyond that, once they've done that, they tend to get in with local political circles, which you've seen with the Emiratis do in Manchester, and you've seen with the Qataris do in Paris. They start getting access to senior political figures who they then can have interchanges with, put pressure on one thing or another. So that's kind of like the hidden face that you don't see, is not as obvious as the brand association.
Can I actually? No, I didn't have anything immediately to say, Justin. I was just nodding in approval. This is excellent. And I wanted to say specifically with Saudi, you can look at the timing of the purchase, and you look at the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, not long before the takeover of Newcastle was sealed. And I always look at it this way: from now on, whenever an authoritarian state purchases a football club, my question is always this: what previous war crime or atrocity, or what future war crime or atrocity are they protecting themselves from? And I actually no longer feel like we should call it sports washing. I'm going to start calling it death insurance, because you're insuring yourself. You have life insurance to insure yourself and the payout in the event of your death. This is death insurance because you're making a payment, a football club in this case, to insure yourself against adverse criticism in the event that your reckless or intentional acts cause the deaths of one or several individuals. Like, it's death insurance. And I think that the examples you've named are really superb, because I've never seen so much conversation of these states as I've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. And that makes me think that the timing of these purchases was absolutely nailed on. It's almost as if these states knew what was coming and they had to buy these clubs to shore up support abroad.
I just want to add to your point, Musa, that also when Saudi came in, it was very clear that they were doing it because it works. Like, we've seen it work with the UAE, we've seen it work with Qatar, we've seen it work with Abramovich, And you see it work on smaller levels with companies and other things like that, not just states. I mean, states is where it's the most nefarious, but it comes in smaller levels and businessmen and whatnot as well. But it was very clear when Saudi came in, it was like, we've seen this work with our neighbors. We're going to do this as well because we need it now.
So the Khashoggi example is very good because there was a period of time after his assassination where the MBS name was extremely taboo, and it forced a lot of, like, literally calling him Mr. Bonesaw, right? And there was a lot of very rich people who were basically shamed out of dealing with him. There was this what was it, Saudi 2030, whatever it was called, conference that ended up it didn't happen, or it was postponed and what have you. And then what happened is that 2 years, 3 years have passed. They managed to buy Newcastle, and now suddenly, or not now obviously, but it's been building up over the years. It's, you know, a bit better. You can interact with the Saudis. You can sort of go there. You can do certain things here and there. Maybe not as openly as you would have before the assassination of Khashoggi, but you can, you know, there's more of a wiggle room than there would if, for example, you literally go to, like, if a, I don't know, sports celebrity goes to Moscow right now. Like, right now it's too hot. Right now it's too politically consequential. Like, you will probably be boycotted. You will probably have some kind of consequences. The worry, obviously, is that there is a model, and this model has been tested many times. We've seen Russian oligarchs buy out certain property, and buying out Chelsea is along that same logic, treating it as property. The fans, obviously, in all of this don't really count. But, you know, it's either a club or a company or property, as in literally real estate or something else. I'm in Switzerland here, pretty notorious for that kind of thing. I'm in the city, probably outside of London, that is the most awash with Russian oligarch money. Like, it's in the last estimates I've seen, and this comes from publiceye.ch. People should check them out. They're fantastic. It's the official estimate was something along the lines of 10 billion, something like that. I think a bit more. But what they have found and what other bankers have since admitted is something more along the lines of $200 billion. And we're talking about, this is Russian taxpayers' money. This is money that is essentially stolen money, because in an oligarchy, in an autocracy, you cannot talk about consent. You cannot talk about, you know, fair, quote unquote, whatever that means, fair businesses, etc. It just can't be. You got your money because of your proximity to power. The sophistication of sports washing leads me to another conversation. It's not even about football in this case. I was involved at some point with a group called IFEX, and we, every year essentially, we would do this campaigning around the Formula One, because, you know, there's the Bahrain one. And Bahrain, for those who don't know, basically there was a extremely vicious crackdown soon after the Arab Spring started in Bahrain, with the help of Saudi tanks, notoriously. And since then, Bahrain went on this huge campaign, sports washing campaign and otherwise, especially in the UK. Folks who may know that the Bahraini royals and the Emirati royals regularly hang out with the Queen and what have you. They go to their events. There's all of that. And at the same time, through those links of different oligarchs, different billionaires, different what have you, at the end of the day, it is a cliche, but it is a club. Like, they kind of, a lot of them know one another. They are comfortable seen in public with one another, Abramovich with the Emiratis, with what have you, that sort of thing. And so at what point, and maybe this is more of I'm not sure, maybe this is more of like an open-ended question. I don't think there's a perfect answer to this in any case. But what is that line? This is what I'm sort of wondering. Again, with Putin, it's very straightforward. And with Putin, it's clear that the line wasn't in 2014. Because the World Cup happened after it. The deals, the Russian gas deals between Germany and that also happened after it, at least were finalized. That the fact that he annexed Crimea wasn't the red line.
Right.
The fact that there is a scenario, and this is unfortunately the more pessimistic side, that if he hadn't gone full on, if he hadn't tried to do the blitzkrieg and remove Zelensky and even kill him maybe and destroy Kiev and what have you, if he had stuck to the regions that he quote unquote recognized, Donetsk and Luhansk, maybe that wouldn't have counted as a red line, and maybe we would still be having, we wouldn't be having this conversation in the same way, basically, because Abramovich would still be comfortable. Everyone else, the oligarchs, would still have their yachts everywhere, etc., etc. What is that line? Like, at what? And I'm talking specifically,
Yes,
football-wise. Like, at what point does it become too much? If you see what I mean.
I think Putin messed with the wrong people's money. It'd be really pessimistic. I think Putin messed with the wrong people's money.
Yeah.
Because he made people really, really scared. When you start talking about nuclear threats, all the rest of it. Look, a lot of those corrupt individuals just want to enjoy their super yachts and their beachside properties. And all of a sudden you're like, hang on a minute. We were doing low-level racketeering, high-level racketeering and corruption. And all of a sudden we're doing bloodbaths. They always say that with the mafia, which is what Putin's state effectively is, there's a mafia administration. They always say the mafia, when a shootout starts, it's being run badly. That the key is actually like there shouldn't be mass shootouts. That then there's a breakdown in the chain of command. So if we're being pessimistic, I think it's the blood. Like with what the Saudi state was doing, the Khashoggi murder was so brutal, so visceral, so graphic. There's probably a lot of people in that administration who were like, why don't you just give that person a lethal injection?
Yeah.
If you poison that
just
man's,
do it in a different way.
Yeah, if you poison that man's food, but you had to go for the ego, you had to go for the big dramatic statement. But for what? Everyone already was buying your oil. Everyone already knew that you were an authoritarian state to be feared in certain contexts. So unfortunately, I think, if I'm honest with you, like the only time we've actually dealt with this is when the egos of these authoritarian individuals go so far that they do stuff that's egregious. But until their egos go out of control, we're happy with it. I mean, you look at Switzerland, but you look at the UK. Roberto Saviano, the author, referred to the UK, or specifically England, I suppose, as the most corrupt country on the planet.
Yeah.
Look, as long as you do your corruption in a three-piece suit.
And Saviano, for those who don't know, he's like a very well-known Italian anti-mafia journalist. So like that is saying something.
One of the world's greatest investigative journalists, who for several years of his life has lived under police escort because his revelations were so dangerous. So I guess what I'm saying is I share your pessimism, because as long as these authoritarian states and individuals keep their egos in check, they're fine. In football, that is. In football.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have much to add there. The only thing I would say is that maybe I'm a little bit more pessimistic, just because like even sometimes the fan reaction has been so much more focused on what these people have done for them sportingly, that they're still willing to defend them, at least in like certain circumstances. However, like maybe on the flip side there, one thing we saw here that we haven't really seen elsewhere is that players got involved on this.
Yeah.
So for example, when, shortly after the invasion, Robert Lewandowski, who's the captain of the Polish national team, came out and said, all right, we're not going to play against Russia. We know it's not the Russian football players' fault, and it's maybe not the national team's fault, but we can't sit by and do nothing. So this is how we're going to act. We're going to boycott. We're not going to play this match. And then I think a couple of other teams that were also scheduled to would have played Russia in certain scenarios in World Cup qualification also took that stand, which then forced FIFA to take a stand. I mean, of course, at the same time, what Musa said about messing with the wrong people's money, and there was already a number of commercial interests in motion. So it came to this as well, and then the sporting bodies had to act. But I do think there was, a place and there was a role, and at least that lent some goodwill from a fan perspective and from people with inside the games perspective that are outside of the FIFA towering organization. And I think it's worth asking this question. While I maybe don't have a solid, strict answer myself, at how much responsibility do players, do coaches, do managers, do staff, etc., and at varying levels, obviously with different levels of popularity and payment and everything else like that. But at what point do you have a responsibility to realize who your employer is? And at what power do you have? What responsibility do you have to confront that and address it in one way or another?
What power and responsibility? Can I just quickly say about the Lewandowski thing? I love that you mentioned that, because that was actually an example of player activism. And I think if we look at that, so Robert Lewandowski, for those who know, is one of maybe the sort of top 3 or 4 strikers in the world, like many people's top striker in the world. So high profile, plays at Bayern Munich, and I think captain of the Poland national team, and just a really respected figure. And for him to speak out against Russia like that was interesting because it was not only political, it was personal, bordering Poland, border of Ukraine, and has had its issues with Russia, obviously, historically. And there's a lot of going on there. And I think the brilliance of that statement that he made was very preemptive. He could see which way this was going. And I think we have a lot to thank Zelensky for, because if Zelensky had basically left the country and Ukraine had lost some of its fighting will, this would be a very different podcast. This would be a terrifyingly different podcast. And I think the brilliance of what Lewandowski did in speaking out when he did and criticizing Putin and Russia's invasion of Ukraine was it forced the sporting bodies away from normalizing this. If Lewandowski hadn't spoken out, we might well have been seeing Russia play in one of the World Cup playoffs. But because he spoke like that, because they made that boycott, Russia's now not appearing at the World Cup. And some might say, oh, well, it's just football. But actually, I think that's hugely significant. And I think the implications of that boycott are yet to be seen. So in terms of what other individuals and figures can do, it doesn't have to be on that scale of Lewandowski, but it just goes to show, actually, Justin and Joey, that speaking out at the right time can make a huge difference. If you time your intervention at a particular point, for example, I think one of the Ukraine players came out with a video. I think it was Yarmolenko, who plays for West Ham. He came out and he said, I know a lot of you Russian footballers. Where are your comments? We hang out, we're friends, we see each other. None of you have spoken about the conflict, about the invasion of Ukraine. So I think those interactions, those are individual acts. They don't have an immediate impact. I mean, Lewandowski's did, that's an unusual one, but I think over time, the incremental effect is huge.
So a couple of things. If sports washing wasn't working, they wouldn't be doing it. They are doing it because it works. As we were talking just before recording this, there's a controversy, it's ongoing now, of one of the karting champions. I don't know what. He's Russian, but he's been competing under the Italian flag because some of them have that capacity now. And he did a Sieg Heil on the what do you call these, podium, on the podium. Yeah. And obviously this is gonna, I'm sure by the time this comes out, I'm sure this is gonna make some noise or what have you. But this for example would be an example of how, well, it's very visual. You literally did Heil Hitler. So this is very visual, it's very obvious. You shouldn't do that if you want to get away with your fascism. Now we're seeing different variations of this. We're seeing the Z letter, which has essentially become a symbol of war. It basically looks like a swastika. Just need to add one stroke. We're seeing all of these things, and so we're seeing when it becomes very visual, or when it becomes too visual, too bloody. Again, as you said, Putin fucked with the wrong kind of money at this point. Whether he just took it a bit too far. If he hadn't, he could have gotten away with it. I think he would have gotten away with it. If Zelensky had fled Ukraine, I think, as you said, I agree. I think that for those who don't know, the Americans actually offered to airlift him. He had that offer and he refused. To his credit, I think he's going to be remembered very well for all of this. And because of that, that decision forced the Europeans, especially the Europeans, even more so than the Americans. I know lots of people online think this is all a US Soviet Union 2.0, but it's actually a very intra-European problem right now. It forced the Europeans to do something about it, because if they hadn't, they knew that, they feared, and rightly so, I think, that it wouldn't stop in Ukraine. So this is when it becomes very obvious. It's when in a situation like this, if you're sports washing, if you're, again, I don't know, flying the Russian flag on the same day as when we found out what happened in Bucha, for example, it's too much. The comparison is very much, it's in the news, it's something a lot of people are thinking about. You wouldn't be able to get away with it. What I'm wondering now is what happens, and maybe again this is why I'm more pessimistic, but I'll caveat this by saying that being pessimistic does not mean it's not cynical, right? I'm not saying that nothing can be done about it. I just think that the likely short-term scenario is probably negative, but doesn't mean we cannot change it.
Yes, absolutely. That's how I feel. Absolutely.
We have the Qatar World Cup coming up, and this World Cup is, even before it started, it's been awash with controversies and allegations of bribery and Obviously, then we looked at the conditions of migrant workers in Qatar, the vast majority of whom come from Southeast Asia, and a huge death toll, actually, because they would be working in horrific conditions under the sun of Qatar. Conditions that are so bad, a heat that is so bad to work under, that footballers have to actually compete there in winter. Like it is very hot in summer. There's a reason, you know. What I'm wondering basically at this point, and again, this is also another kind of open question, I don't think there's a perfect answer, is there is a momentum going on. I don't know how much the momentum will still be there by winter. I have no idea. But let's say it's there in some format in one way or another. What can we do to sort of build on that momentum to either force some kind of pressure of the type that the Qataris right now do not want? For example, they do not want to think about it. They want to try and avoid it as much as possible. There's a lot of reason why I think, if I'm having this analysis right, even the Emiratis and the Saudis are struggling much more. And I don't like to use struggle when it comes to Saudi and Emirati elites, but in the sense that they're having more difficulties right now, whitewashing and sports watching their way out of any problem. We're seeing more tensions, more problems, and geopolitically, the fact that the Emiratis and the Saudis haven't condemned the invasion of Ukraine is leading a lot, it's kind of ruffling a lot of feathers. I would recommend I'll put it in the description if I remember the title of the latest episode of the Arab Tyrant Manual podcast with Iyad Baghdadi and Ahmad Gatnash was on Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates and the geopolitical aspect of it, and how Iyad was arguing, and I agree with him, that they're actually not, how will I say this? Like they may be actually screwing themselves over. They're not playing their cards very well, because it's not rocket science to understand why very rich billionaires like Mohammed bin Salman, who has never had to do anything in his life, who has never had any challenges in his life, all of that, why this man, for those who don't know, was actually genuinely surprised that he got a lot of backlash after murdering Khashoggi. Like he genuinely thought that he would get away with it.
He said he was quoted in The Atlantic recently saying that was a very hard time for him.
Because of that, these are people whose money has spoken for them on their behalf. They didn't need to do much speaking for the most part. They didn't have to interact with the public, so to speak, for the most part. They've been able to get away with a lot of things. What I'm wondering is whether there is an opportunity there with Qatar that may not be possible, or at least not as easy, if you see what I mean. I don't know if that made sense.
Perfect sense. Can I actually throw this in as well? I've got a suggestion. So you mentioned the Atlantic interview. I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, Justin, because I think it's about trying to get, among other things, negative coverage in the types of places they can't avoid.
Yeah.
So they don't want, for example, cameras in Qatar because they know that stuff will be sent back on social media. They're doing media blackouts. Now, I know people are working hard to get images out of Qatar. I know that because they will be doing it, whether I know them or not. I know many people will be doing that, trying to get the images out. But if you think about those publications, they have got a huge responsibility. I'm talking about the Financial Times, Reuters, the types of publications that those people the websites they'll be reading and the stuff they'll be on their desks. And I say this because I noticed the New York Times had a particular impact on the Conservative Party, the UK government. So whenever opinion pieces were in the New York Times, the Conservative Party responded really badly because they knew they couldn't ignore those, because those are the types of publications that they find in their airport lounges, on their coffee tables. So that's one strategy, just one strand. The other thing is what fans can do. So a really good friend of mine did an amazing thing during the Bahrain Grand Prix, Formula One Grand Prix a few years ago. So the time of the protests, when the protests were really sort of heating up, she basically, for each lap that went round of the GP, she said, oh, okay, this is lap 2 of the Grand Prix. And then she would tweet the name and the age of a protester who'd been killed by the government, the Bahrain government. And she did this for 78 laps. Wow. And it was incredible that the thread went super viral. And when she did that, security firms on Twitter started writing, going, everything is calm in Bahrain, everything's fine, and like completely got jittery. And I thought, if people got the names, for example, of like migrant workers and tweeted for every minute of the World Cup the name of a migrant worker who died in the construction of the stadium, or someone who'd been killed through the human rights abuses perpetrated by that state, that'd be incredibly powerful. Like, you imagine a Twitter account from the beginning of the Qatar World Cup, and every minute of the World Cup it tweets the death of the details of a worker and some details about their lives. I think that's the kind of thing that is exceptionally powerful.
That's actually a very good idea. I'm in contact with migrantrights.org. I don't know.
You imagine that, though. You imagine how viral that would go. This is the first. Imagine, because you know how a tweet is. This is the first tweet in the thread. This is the first minute of the World Cup, and we're going to tweet every, let's say, 5 minutes, the name and the age and the nationality and a little bit of detail about the life of someone who was killed constructing the stadium. By the end of the World Cup, the end of the month, you'd have like tens of thousands of retweets of that initial tweet and the thread. Just one example.
Yeah.
There is somebody was in contact with me. It was a group that were putting together like playing cards, and on each of the playing cards were like a migrant who was killed working in Qatar and the lead up. Yeah, I think, Musa, your points are super prescient, and to really to keep the focus is important. You know, I wanted to add one thing that I think maybe we need to figure out how to do, but will be a challenge, is how to keep also not just important media, but sports media to focus on this. Because, you know, sometimes it's been written as kind of an afterthought. There's been some sports journalists really pushing, really trying to do great stuff on this. But the thing is it's not just like fans and FIFA, but also sometimes sports reporters aren't used to this. They don't know how to handle this necessarily. So I think if any sort of media outlet can give their staff kind of training or come up with a sort of strategy, like an editorial strategy about how to incorporate this into all their coverage, you know, whether that's TV, print, or beyond. And I know that's not necessarily commercially enticing all the time, but from an ethical and a moral standpoint, I think that if, you know, individual journalists and media outlets and people of conscience can kind of come together, and maybe people who are reading these outlets can kind of push and ask for this sort of stuff, to put the focus that while it is not, you know, I don't want to like demonize individuals or individual journalists, because ultimately it's bigger than each individual. And
Yes,
I kind of believe that in a way Qatar's already kind of won, right? It's really late now. Yeah, we hope that this will teach us for the next tournaments that come up, that we can be more focused on these sort of things. But I would say that, like, you know, us as individuals, let's try to think about what we can do. I think that, you know, the example you gave, Musa, is a brilliant example. If we as individuals, as activists, as journalists, as whatever else we do, can also do that. And then if media organizations can come together and figure out how they can contribute to this as well, and maybe just like keep it at the front and center of people's minds, I think that would be really powerful. Because I did a video some time back asking if people should boycott the Qatar World Cup. And I'll say very honestly, you know, kind of to my shame, and I've done a lot of reflection since, doesn't make it okay. Like, I was in Russia for the World Cup in a personal capacity, not in a professional capacity. And so I asked people, should people boycott the World Cup in Qatar? You know, this is something I put to human rights activists, fan groups, etc. And kind of the thing that came back to me was that it's not down to the individual fan, not to wipe away their responsibility completely, but it's not down to them. What they choose to do or not won't individually change too much. However, if you do choose to go, don't forget about what's happening. Don't look over it. Don't publicize these things where, you know, you show like, oh, look, it looks great to me, because, you know, one's person experience is not always universal. Somebody coming from Europe or the US or elsewhere won't be, you know, one of the predominantly South Asian workers' experiences. So, you know, if people do choose to engage and watch and everything else, it's like, I would say, don't forget about it. Keep doing your research, search for more information. And then the people who are sharing that information, see if there's just, you know, ways that we can come together and connect and spread it to wider networks. And if we can find media that's able to have some sort of editorial strategy to get that out to a wider audience, so that it's not just doing like sports reports, but also including that in almost every piece of their coverage somehow or the other, I think that would be really powerful, though it is, you know, quite the challenge as well.
Yeah.
I think on that same topic, I also agree. It would be very, very difficult, as far as I understand it, for Qatar to really do a lot of censoring when the eyes of the world are on you. Like, they will still do some of it, definitely more than if the World Cup was in Paris or what have you. But it will be very difficult for them to get away with a lot of it, or even most of it. They will actually have to show more tolerance, quote unquote, towards that kind of political expression than they would otherwise. And here I will link, as it happens, to another episode that I did, which will come out after this one, so it's not out yet, although it's out on Patreon for those who want. That I did with Dana Kurd, who's a good friend of mine. She's Palestinian. And she wrote this paper on the role of pro-Palestine activism in the Arab world specifically in pro-democracy movements. And the main argument, and her case study was actually Qatar, which is why I'm bringing it up. The main argument, which is a pretty good one, and she does it, she argues for it very convincingly, I think, that in a country like Qatar, where the average Qatari citizen, or even technically a subject, right, because it's a monarchy, an absolute monarchy at that, politics in and of itself is almost always a threat to the regime. You can only go too far in having any kind of political revendication. So her specific example is that if you're a Qatari citizen and you're making certain political demands when it comes to the Palestinian cause, you're not just speaking on behalf of Palestinians or defending Palestinian rights, but you're also making a political demand in Qatar as a Qatari citizen. And this, if the government doesn't handle it very well, in some cases, and we know this from other cases, they would allow certain flexibility. There's a word for it in Arabic, tanfis, which means that they allow, tanfis is like, imagine a balloon and the air is coming out of the balloon. So you're letting air out. You're letting some steam out, essentially. It's a very tricky situation for those regimes. For various reasons, mostly historical. The Palestinian cause is obviously a very emotional one. It's very dear to many folks in the region. They have to navigate that. Sometimes, as the Emiratis did, they go full-on crackdown. The Emiratis, long before the normalization with the State of Israel, the so-called Abraham Accords, were shutting down a lot of activist groups and stuff like that to anticipate it. And this is why folks like me and others knew that this was coming long before the Abraham Accord, by like at least 5-6 years. So it wasn't much of a surprise. But that doesn't matter as much here. The point is that these regimes always have to moderate how much political expression is allowed in the public sphere. In the private sphere is a bit different. But in public sphere, which includes online, by the way, especially online, actually, when it's going to come to the actual World Cup, they're going to have to be very sensitive about it. And it is possible, because we are dealing with an authoritarian regime that has never really had to deal with political complexity in any real shape, way or form, that they will overreach. They will make mistakes. They will maybe be too brutal in something. If there is a protest, if there is even online protest, they may crack down on someone. We know this has happened in the past, but now there will be a lot of cameras all around. My argument, if you want, is that there will be a very specific role that foreign journalists, more so than Arab journalists, because Arab journalists have a lot of obstacles depending on their nationality. If they're going as Saudis, if they're going as Egyptians, then they wouldn't just be in trouble in Qatar, they would be in trouble obviously in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt. But let's say Western journalists, CNN, your BBC, Euronews, France 24, what have you, they will be able to say much more than Arab journalists, than local journalists. And I do think they need to be pressed on that. Now, they may not go specifically as investigative journalists. They may still cover the matches primarily. That may still be their main thing. But nothing stops them from tweeting about migrants. It doesn't take anything.
Yeah, but this is a great point. It's the self-censorship. Yeah. I noticed, and I won't name names because, again, we don't want to it's not about individuals, but I did notice individuals who'd been to Qatar for the draw and who were there prior to the World Cup start tweeting about progressive measures were made. This, and I was like, hang on a minute. I think we shared this in the group, and I was like, this is how they get you. Yeah. This is how they get you. Progress has been made. No, a lot of those worker deaths go uninvestigated, unexplained, because you're forcing them to work in these adverse conditions and their hearts have stopped or whatever, they had health complications. So to see people, and this is the thing, the grim thing is, it's not the subtlety of sports washing is that you can go to a nice event, you can go to a nice house party and have a chat with a really urbane, smart ambassador who's, lived in Tokyo and Bratislava and Sao Paulo. And half an hour into that conversation, you swapped a business card, you've made a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And it means there's the tweet that you don't send out.
Yeah.
It means there's something. That's why I don't want to go to the World Cup in Qatar, not because I'm a, quote, good person. It's because I'm actually concerned about that subtle type of sports washing. I know that I'm quite friendly. I try to be quite convivial. So I know if I go to a place like that, I'm more likely not to say the things I should say because of this atmosphere of kind of gentle prodding and easing. There was even a conversation that someone said, I think the journalist Miguel Delaney said, actually, it's not good when people in Qatar, Western journalists in Qatar, Western pundits defend Qatar because it makes them look worse. It looks as if they've been briefed. What they want is the kind of gentle messaging and massaging of journalistic egos. So I think there's an opportunity, weirdly enough, to get in touch with those Arab journalists prior to the World Cup. So Western journalists can get in touch with Arab journalists prior to the World Cup and be like, what should we be covering that we don't know about? What human rights abuses don't we know about? What can we talk about while we're in Qatar? What can we raise awareness of? So that way we're doing the work of, you see it the whole time, like New York Times and Der Spiegel and other organizations, joint investigations. I think a similar thing has to happen here, like more collaboration, I think, across borders.
Yeah, that's a lovely point. I would add that it's really important to make sure that we're watching more than just kind of the state talking points or treat every state talking point extremely critically. Because, for example, some people say things like, well, there's been progress or there's been law changes. And that's true. There have been law changes. Now, the implementation of those law changes, according to rights groups, is extremely low and favors locals over the foreign laborers. So, there's social and cultural like factors at play here as well, in addition to just like whether a law was changed or not and how, there's the implementation, etc. So yeah, I just wanted to add that point.
That's a very good point. And just to also add to that, Justin, journalists who are not Qataris, who have no connection to Qatar, who haven't done work on migrant rights in Qatar, on the kafala system, what have you, they shouldn't be the ones saying that there's been progress. They're not the ones to make that judgment. There are lots of rights groups, as you mentioned, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, migrantrights.org, so many others that if anyone listening to this, literally Google Qatar and follow it up with the word kafala, Kafala, or just write probably migrant. There's so much already being done and has been written about for a long time now. They are the ones that have to say that, like, in a more ideal world, let's put it this way, the Qatari government would actually invite Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and all of those others and have an independent investigation, and they get to determine whether the laws are applicable, whether they're being applied, whether there's been actual improvement, whether there's been accountability for those who already died. It's not like, this is the problem with these situations, especially with Qatar, is that they can do a lot of and the Saudis would have done the same thing were it not for MBS's Khashoggi murder, is that as long as they do certain things incrementally, right, like the Saudi example, even before Khashoggi, is a very obvious one because on the one hand, MBS was implementing and still is implementing all of those reform laws, allowing quote-unquote women to drive, while arresting the Saudi women who were campaigning for the right to drive. Because again, this is where Tanfis comes in. It's like, okay, the Saudis at some point, MBS realized okay, this is probably too much. Like the banning of women, like not letting women drive, that's too much. We can't, this isn't something we can work with politically in 2019 or whenever they changed it. I don't remember, 2018, 2019. But if we let those activists, Lujain and all of those others, if we don't still punish them somehow, this will mean that their political campaign succeeded. This will mean that they did something politically which led to actual political change. And that's a very dangerous idea in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
We, those of us in Europe, what have you, different risk levels for different individuals. But the journalists who will be able to go to Qatar, I'm not an expert on Qatari politics. I just know enough, I think I can say this confidently, that it will be very difficult for them to really go after CNN journalists, BBC journalists, France 24 journalists. Like maybe they intimidate, maybe they try here and there, but I just don't see it happening on a large scale in the same way that they would against Qataris, or the same way that the Saudis would against, the Saudi citizens or what have you. And so there is an ethical responsibility there, in a way that I'm hoping, if there's enough pressure, with the topic of sports washing becoming more of a hopefully mainstream conversation in the context of Abramovich, in the context of the Saudi takeover of Newcastle or what have you, then maybe next time around the mistakes of the World Cup in Russia aren't repeated, or at least not repeated in the same way. This would be the more optimistic
These are brilliant
take.
points. These are brilliant points, actually, because I think even the Eddie Howe example that was mentioned there, Justin mentioning Fabian Goer's example of Eddie Howe at Newcastle United having to answer questions about, authoritarian states owning your club in a press conference. That felt new. That felt really new. And I think it's all about shattering those taboos. We talk so much about regressive forces shattering taboos. For example, we saw that Nazi salute on the podium. We saw the Z, which is the new fascist symbol. So often we go, oh my God, that's so subversive. The right has shattered a taboo. How about the progressive forces shatter their own taboos? How about they say the unsayable? We've seen the power of what happens when you have a Dutch economist going to Davos talking about inequality. And that one conversation changed the global discourse on inequality. One conversation where he said the thing that everyone knew. So I suppose the question in Qatar is, what are the unsayable things that we can have people say on the huge stages? Because they might trigger that Instagram post that a player might want wanting to tweet all along, or send along. There might be a footballer out there, there might be an advocate out there, a journalist or a public figure who is just absolutely dying to say one particular thing, and a journalist speaking the unspeakable in Qatar during the World Cup might just say that one thing that triggers an absolute, an avalanche of change. So I'm optimistic from that perspective, because we've seen that all authoritarian states are characterized by not their strength, but their fragility. They're terrified of the wrong thing being said at the wrong time, and this bringing it all down. Here ends the lesson.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Exactly.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing to that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely, I think it would be quite embarrassing for the Qataris if, the Dutch national team, for example, does something that they did in qualifying and goes on the field with shirts that say things like human rights, or, something maybe more explicit as well. Though I do think any journalist that does have a responsibility to be careful, not just for their own personal safety, but for the safeties of the people they're speaking to, because even if they may escape and be deported or whatever may have you, the locals, or the local, let's say, call them, the people that are under the kafala system, which are the laborers, as you mentioned, Joy, mostly from South Asia, will, that could potentially very much disrupt their life, their livelihood. And so that, just for anybody thinking of going there, if there's somebody listening by chance, I really would encourage people to do the work, but also to take prior steps to talk to aid organizations or human rights organizations about how to do that.
Absolutely. Do your research. I mean, that's what journalists should be doing, of course. Amnesty, as I said, those three that I mentioned, there are more than, but those three alone, I must have read like 10,000 words worth of investigation, and The Guardian has done quite a lot on that as well, for quite some time now. Like, this isn't a secret. There are careful ways of doing it, not putting the people you're talking to or what have you at risk. There are responsible way of doing so. There are journalists who have done so, obviously, in much worse situations than Qatar. There are ways around it. I would hope that journalists take those precautions. And the other thing is that, like, unfortunately, there's been so many migrant workers who have already died in Qatar. Who obviously, if you name them, there will be, probably there won't be any direct consequences. Their families are back in Nepal or Pakistan or India or what have you. They are the ones already calling for accountability. They're calling for shedding light on that sort of thing. So, it's I can easily imagine like a bunch of journalists agreeing from now, deciding either doing so before they go to Qatar, or doing so once they are in Qatar, so that, the visa and what have you, and being willing to deal with the risks if they feel that, the worst case scenario is that they might be deported or whatnot. It will have to be like at what is the... It's an individual journalist decision, and each one of them will have to decide, among themselves, like what is an acceptable risk and whatnot. Obviously, if they really feel like the risk is too high, then that's up to them. There will be different, risk levels depending on the journalist, reputation, or fame, I should say, of like how the what's the word I'm looking for? Like how well known the media organization they work for is, like CNN, what have you. If you work for CNN, you're probably more protected than if you work for some local or a smaller media outlet, let's put it that way, probably, my best guess. So there would be different, levels and whatnot. But I think that if this becomes, and we have some time now to push that point forward, I really think there's a momentum for it. And the impact could be like for tweets, that's maybe in a report here and there, what have you. A single video of a Qatari security serviceman pushing or even beating or censoring, what have you, a CNN journalist will look very bad, will look really bad for the Qataris. And they will probably, if they're smart, and I have some doubts about it, they will be careful not to do that. But as I said, authoritarians tend not to think long term. They really genuinely think that they will get away with everything because they have the money for it. Maybe now they're a bit smarter because of, Abramovich and what have you. Maybe now they're a bit more on their toes. Maybe, I don't know. But there's a good chance that even with all of that, they're just, high off their own supply and they're very comfortable in their positions, and you can get them that way because they're not expecting it.
Yeah. And I want to keep hammering this point home. Any organization that's ever, this is the beginning of time, has had a communications department, a communications function, and there are conversations that you're afraid of starting or beginning. What are the journey, the trick, the question for all activists and journalists or regular individuals concerned about this? What are the questions? There's a list somewhere of the questions and the conversations that the authorities holding this work are afraid of.
Yeah.
Find out. The job that we all have in the next few months is to find out what those conversations are and to begin and prolong as many of them as possible. That's our job, I think.
Yeah.
Definitely. I would also say that it's important to be precise with the criticisms because there's been a lot of criticisms thrown about.
Yes.
And some are valid maybe for sporting reasons. But then some are also, have been ways for the Qataris to just dismiss and use for racism or something like that. People saying something like, oh, well, what is Qatar for a football country? I mean, the accusations, I think there's a lot of fire or a lot of smoke behind, the accusations of corruption and whatnot. But the act of the World Cup going to a place it's never been before, I think there's different ways to interpret that, but I don't think that in itself is a criticism. The fact it's being played in winter, despite being sold as summer, has been, labeled as some to be a criticism. But I think it's important to really hone in on a couple of things, which is that one, the human life that was lost in the build-up to this World Cup, the mistreatment of laborers, of workers in the run-up to this World Cup, and still including until today. And the third thing I would say is the third point would actually be the human rights situation within the country for LGBTQ people, for minorities, and for the workers themselves. So I think it's really important to stay focused on at hand and not get it muddled up into a bunch of different, or just throwing mud and see what sticks, because some of that, particularly if we say something like, oh, what is an Arab country doing hosting a World Cup, or a country that's never done it before? These are things that I've heard, and I think that allows the Qataris to kind of say, oh, this is just like Western racism, or this is just Western superiority. And we need voices. We need, as an Arab voice, I'm happy to come out and say that. While normally I would be thrilled to see, football, a World Cup in an Arabic-speaking country, or in an Arab country, definitely not under the circumstances where it's an authoritarian government, where there's been the loss of human life and where human rights are violated on a daily basis.
That's a very good point. Thanks, Justin. I wanted to add one other group, just because I'm on this topic. They're called the Gulf Center for Human Rights. I've worked with them when I was at IFAX. And as of today, as it happens, at the time of recording, which is April 11th, they've released a report on a Qatari human rights activist who's based in Europe called Abdel al-Maliki. And he's based in Europe, as I said. He risks deportation to Qatar due to this whole Interpol red notice thing, which is an entire problem in and of itself. And if he's there, the Qatari security, whatever it is, people can look up the report. It's a Gulf Center for Human Rights, as I said, have recommended the death penalty. So just to emphasize, and maybe we can close off on this specific topic, that this is ongoing. The Qataris are still doing it because they genuinely still think that they can get away with these things. They do not think that the costs of bad PR or whatnot are high enough. That report, for example, got like 4 retweets since this morning. Like, these are not things that are well known, but they can become when the momentum is right, when there's enough pressure on this topic, etc., etc. So before we get into the book section, very quickly from you, if that's okay, and it's an open question. So again, as most of these questions so far, like, feel free to answer however you want. How do you and so I'll preface this by saying, like, Musa, I've listened to some of the episodes on Stadio, and at some point you said, for example, I think it was Manchester United that you support, if I remember correctly. You said that at some point you were worried that if the Super League had gone on, I don't remember the details, that like you would stop watching, or you would be worried that it's too much that you just can't.
I would have stopped supporting.
Yeah,
without question. I think. Yeah.
So the question on that is, how can we still find how do you two specifically? How do you two still find the love in the game and the beautiful potential in it? Because I genuinely still do, and again, I don't follow as much as you two do.
Yeah.
Despite
it's
all
because
of this.
football was here long before these institutions, and it'll be there long after. Long after football's use has been expended by these authoritarian states who never really loved the game, who loved it least of all, it will be gone. The same with, people that, observe a religious faith. Their faith was there long before a lot of these institutions and individuals came along and said that they determine what someone's faith should be, and it'll be there long after. You look at, like, Christians who see institutions being built up and abuse is done in their name. That's not me. That's not my faith, right? I've got friends who feel that way. And, for me, I would say with football, I love the game and I hate the sport. I love the joy. I love the playfulness. I love, watching nutmegs in the local park. I love that. I love going to games and, walking up along the riverside to the city ground as I was at the weekend, and that collective feeling of like you're going to see a spectacle. I love all of that. That will never, ever go for me. And I think we need to remove as many people from the sport who don't have its best interests at heart as possible. And I suppose that's the thing. I mean, maybe it's pretentious, maybe it's idealistic, but I've always got in my head a vision of the ideal football club. Let's say a club that's owned partly by regular fans and partly by a renewable energy company that's pushing the world forward with positive messaging about where the world can go. I have an idea of a utopian infrastructure of a football club, but I also have an idea of just a utopian game of football, and that no one in football has the power to change that. I think
we got to get you in a room with Mathieu Flamini.
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah. One of the great footballers / investors of the modern era. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me, football is imperfect, but it's also always been a form of community, and in a way, it's shown me what community can be. Somebody who's grown up with, kind of like yourself, Joey, and Musa, you as well, having parents from a certain background, and then I'm mixed, and then 5 generations of constant moving. I never fit neatly into a religion, a race, a nationality, a whatever have you. I never felt like a belonging in that way. And so football taught me that. My best friends, a lot of my best friends are footballers or football fans, and that's been a way for us to come together. So the beauty in it for me is still about that community. And in a lot of ways, I'm a lot less attached to the top level teams that I used to support, or team that I used to support. And I'm a lot more attached to the human connections I've made through the game. So, I have a game, like a morning game that I play in every once in a while. And, some of the people that I've met there come from very diverse backgrounds. And, we build a community, we come together and we play. And it's a way for us to connect with people who you definitely wouldn't meet in many other ways. And I remember I'll maybe add a small anecdote here that Marcelo Bielsa, who's a famous Argentinian football manager, said that he came from a very wealthy family. I did not, but Bielsa did, and he said that football helped expose him to, in a way, poverty, or people who were impoverished in a way that he would have never met them otherwise, and that also taught him about inequality. It taught him about justice. It taught him about, it kind of made him an idealist in a way. And so I think in the same way is that football's been a prism for me to be able to see the world. And so I hang on to it because there's still good in it. It's imperfect, of course, but it is a way for me to connect with people, to have community, and to imagine a future where maybe there will be a nation that will look like, my football crew.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that.
Love that.
Well, on this fantastic note, what are 3 books that you would recommend to our amazing listeners, and why those 3?
David Goldblatt, The Ball is Round. That's just a book about the history of football generally and the overlap with politics. I would also recommend Football Against the Enemy by Simon Kuper, just because it's a foundational text on the overlap between football and politics. And finally, I would recommend, I think it's Galeano, Soccer in Sun and Shadow, because he also wrote Open Veins of Latin America. So if you read that and then you go into Open Veins of Latin America, you'll be like, oh, it's completely possible to write about football and the beauty of football, but also not be defined by that, and not to ignore everything that's happening off the field. Because I think a lot of people, I've recommended those 3 texts because a lot of people use their love of football as an excuse not to talk about the aspects that they find more painful. And the fact that Galeano wrote maybe 2 of the greatest books, he's my hero. Like, to write those 2 books, which are arguably the greatest football book ever written, and one of the greatest books about Latin America ever written, like that to me is true greatness. And that shows that the overlap is possible to hold and love and consider football and politics equally. So yeah, those are my 3 books.
Yeah, I love the Galeano shout out. I think there's especially in the Anglophone world, there's such like an anti-intellectualism within football. And then when you read, writers like him or certain Portuguese writers, like they just totally put trash to that sort of idea that you can't intellectualize football or analyze it from the aesthetic or the art. So mine, I didn't pick football books. I have You Have Not Yet Been Defeated by Alaa, which I read earlier this year and was just incredibly inspirational with how it mixed politics and hope, really, especially from somebody who spent the better part of recent years in prison, or at least having to check into a prison, spend his nights in a jail and his days, trying to spend time with his daughter, though I believe at the moment he's currently in prison again.
Yeah, I was just to take the opportunity. So Alaa Abdel, he's an Egyptian activist, one of the most brilliant intellectuals, I would say, that has come out of the Arab Spring. And he spent the better part of the past decade or so either entirely in prison, or he's had the system where at 6 p.m. he would have to check in prison, and then at 6 a.m. he can get out again. So he would have to sleep in prison essentially every day for like several years incoming. And for the past, I'm going to say 10 days now at the time of recording, I think 9 to 10 days, he has been on hunger strike. His situation is pretty bad, and I'm genuinely very worried for him. So yeah, but that book, I also have it. I started reading it. It's a fantastic book. I would include it in the all of the books that we mentioned. I will include in the description as well, and I recommend people check it out. So I continue, Justin.
Yeah. No, it's incredibly inspirational. And the second one is also an Egyptian author. Her name is Basma Abdel Aziz, and I read a book by her about 6 years ago called The Queue in English. It's translated from Arabic, and it basically speaks about an authoritarian country in the Arab world and kind of how people interact with that and live in that. And it's a great read. Lastly, I wanted to throw in one football book. So I read recently 1312 by James Peter Montague, though he has actually written something that would maybe be more relevant to this conversation, which is the Billionaires Club, which speaks about kind of this money and the various billionaire figures in the football world. So those are my 3, and I would just like to add that anything that Musa's written is also incredibly inspirational and touching.
Man. Make an old man cry.
Well, Musa, actually, I mean, those who already know this by now, but like Musa, this is your 4th time on the podcast, and you're the first one who has come here 4 times. So, thank you for that.
Can I say I'm actually that makes me extremely proud. I didn't want to say it, but I'm extremely proud because Joey, you once did a list of like I think over 100 podcasts to listen to. Like you curated all these different things, and I'm like, wow, like. You listen to a lot of stuff, so to be on this platform is a real like. It's I'm very honored. So thank you.
Pleasure.
You gotta make him a jacket.
Oh my God, yes. Where's my jacket?
This was fantastic.
Good.
Yeah, this was fantastic. Thanks a lot for your time.
Absolute pleasure.
That was fun.
The Far East Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/FarEastTimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.